first of all, Caroline, very happy to meet you in person. Like, of course, it's a virtual in person, but really thank you for making the time. I really look forward to speaking with you about the book you wrote. And of course, also hopefully more Chinese readers could, read or access your book as well.
Yeah, I've got the Chinese version. Do you not have the Chinese version?
I don't.
So this is the Chinese version.
Wonderful. Okay, then you should read that one to us.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think this is Chinese version, although obviously I can't actually read it.
You'll be forgiven. That's okay.
It's a great cover. I like it a lot.
Thank you. It's a great design of the book, and then
it is a really great design.
I want to start. Yeah, with our conversation, I think, because when I first got this book, I didn't get it. I was like, it's an interesting book. Why there are so many men on the book? It's about women. And I realized, if you look tilted, it's the women are in between, the men are invisible. Yeah, it's a brilliant design. I think that kind of echoes to the theme you've been trying to promote in this book, around how women or women's angle were missing in, I guess, literally all aspects of social life, right?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that will be my first question. What kind of triggered you or inspired you to write this book?
Oh, that is a question with a really long answer. Because it really was a book that came about as a result of me building up for about 10 years of kind of unconsciously collecting all this evidence and getting increasingly frustrated that no one could see what I could see.
Mm-hmm.
And then ultimately I ended up having to write the book. So it started when I went to university a bit late. I went to my mid-20s. And until that point, I'd never been a feminist. I didn't consider myself a feminist. I actually was I was anti-feminist. I was antagonistic towards feminism. I found it embarrassing. I thought it made women look bad. I didn't want to be associated with it. And I really had a very low opinion of women. I would definitely call myself, like my past self, a misogynist. I believed what I saw in films, in books, in the media, that represented women as sort of trivial, hysterical, over-emotional. And I just thought, well, I'm not like that. But instead of thinking, well, maybe they're misrepresenting women, I just thought other women are terrible and I'm somehow different. I'm not like them. And so I wasn't interested in a movement for women because I didn't identify with women. And this basically all changed one day in the university library when I was reading this book called Feminism and Linguistic Theory. And it introduced me to, well, not exactly introduced me to the idea of the generic masculine, because I had heard about it before, I'd just always dismissed it. So it was talking about the generic masculine in language. So using he to mean he or she, man to mean humankind. I'm not entirely sure how that would translate in Chinese. Like, is it a gendered language in that way, so that you, like, is it like French and Spanish where
I would say it's better than in those languages. There's a very clear, like, male and female. Many things, frankly, from that angle, Chinese are pretty equal. So, like, if there's person is a person, there isn't man or women into it.
Interesting. Okay, so I guess that bit, that doesn't translate as well. But anyway, we do have that in English where we use the male form gender neutrally. And I and it's something that I'd sort of known that feminists like complain about, and I just sort of had it in my head as this is another example of how stupid feminists are, that they're complaining about this thing. This is so ridiculous. Everyone knows that it's gender neutral. I'm not like those crazy feminists. I don't complain about stupid things. But in this book, the author pointed to this research that showed that when people read or hear these words, they picture men. And that completely blew my mind, because it made me realize for the first time that I was picturing men when I saw these words. And I just found it astonishing that I'd never noticed that before. And also that I was picturing men when I'm a woman. Like, if it's a gender neutral word, why am I not picturing women ever? And then I started realizing how I was picturing men for all sorts of actually gender neutral terms, like doctor and lawyer, professor, writer. And so that got me started on thinking about my attitude to women, how I viewed women, when I recognized that my head was full of men, full of impressive men. You know, I looked at all the media, the books that I was told were great books were by men and about men. The history that I was taught was about men. So my whole world was populated by men. No wonder I didn't identify with women. No wonder I thought women were these sort of trivial niche people. And so that's how it started. And because I think that because that was the way I got into feminism, this recognizing that all this time I thought I was speaking gender neutrally, and other people think they're speaking gender neutrally, and actually they're talking about men without realizing, meant that I was kind of primed to notice it when it cropped up in other areas. So that was the beginning of the journey. And then the journey involved me noticing it in different areas. So for example, as I write about in the book, with the economy and the way that we don't account for the unpaid care work that is mainly done by women. We don't count it as an economic activity. It's not included in GDP. And so when we're allocating resources and deciding what our government spending should be, we're ignoring this huge swathe, this very feminized swathe of the economy. I did some work with some volunteering with a charity for female asylum seekers, where I found out about the international law on refugees and how that too, you know, is a gender neutral international law, and also is not deliberately, you know, this was a really important part of it, is that people don't realize they're doing this. This law wasn't written deliberately to make it harder for female asylum seekers to claim asylum, but that nevertheless is the outcome, because it was written based around the experience generally of men. So for example, things like having to leave the country that you're fleeing from before you can claim asylum is much harder to do as a woman, because women are much less likely to be formally employed, less likely therefore to be able to get a visa. You also, when you arrive in the country that you're claiming asylum in, you can't just say I'm being persecuted. You have to be able to demonstrate that your persecution fits into these neat little boxes. And these boxes tend to pertain to the ways in which men tend to be persecuted. So, you know, religion, political affiliation, you know, all things that women can be persecuted for. But the number one reason that female asylum seekers will give is that they are women. That tends to be why women are being persecuted. And then, so this was sort of gradually building up, and I was getting more and more frustrated reading sort of policy documents and things that were clearly all about men, but were presented gender neutrally. And then finally, when I was researching my first book, I came across this research that even in medicine, the study of actual human bodies, we were acting as if the male body was gender neutral, and that as a result, there are all sorts of diseases that we misdiagnose in women, that we know far less about in women, treatments that don't work as well for women. And that just, you know, that was like the final straw for me, that I sort of felt like I just couldn't believe it, you know, I felt like I was going crazy.
It feels like a crime.
How is it possible that in medicine, you know, this is the study of bodies? It's one thing, right, that for us to be sexist in culture, for us to be biased in culture, because culture is subjective, but this is objective. This is science. Yeah. How is this happening? And why doesn't everyone know about it? And why isn't it front page news? And so that was the thing that tipped me over into writing the book. But I don't think I would have been tipped over into writing the book if the previous 9 years hadn't happened, of me gradually getting more and more frustrated, and then finally discovering this, and then just going, ah! So I said it was a long answer, but that's
that's great, because it was interesting. I echo with it, because it's I'm similar to you. Like I wasn't, like, I think I was pretty quote unquote successful, you know, in school and at work. And you quoted Sheryl Sandberg quite a few times in your book, talk about, you know, basically what she's recommending is that you just behave like a man in a way, right? That's the way to succeed. And I have been rewarded by it. So I completely understand what you're saying like, you know, it's fine, you know, just quit complaining. If you're like me, you could be good too. Like, why are you like so fuzzy about little things like this and that? until you realize it's not. And then there are so many, because one of my best friend is actually a faculty or professor, is still doing research. And then you have a chapter, I think, talked about how scientists, especially female scientists, are being penalized in terms of not getting tenure or getting it much later or getting less funding, which is so true, right? There are people basically knows that. And then like everybody, there are two sides that's kind of striking. One is that it's not like people don't know. Okay, people know, right? So like, like that's why if you're a female, either you have a husband that doesn't have an academic job, or you don't have a child. Okay, sort of, it's pretty prevalent. And second is that after people know about it, just exactly as I said, as the medicine, like people are okay with it. Like in a way, well, we're fine. Like, this is life. Like there is almost this like intentional blindness to these issues, and seems that that's okay, and pretend that there is a bigger issues we should be concerned about. Okay, there's war going on, like there's climate change. Why are you talking about taking care of a child? But I guess the click came to me is that I realized, the war and climate change is because the omission of women. Even those big issues are there. So I wanted, kind of start from the end of the book. You actually, afterward, you quoted Jane Austen saying the chorus of popes and kings with wars and pestilences in every page. The men so good for nothing and hardly any women at all. It is very tiresome. Which is true.
I love that quote.
But I think that was my connection to this issue. It was very interesting because I have 3 kids. I have 2 boys, and the youngest is a girl, and she's 8 years old. So of course we listen to history. We talk about there's Chinese history, there's world history, and there's stories they listen to. And my daughter asked me once, like, why all the history is war after war after war. That's so true, right? If you think about like in Chinese history from ancient times, it's dynasty change. Okay, all the dynasty change or started with some kind of uprising and war and killing and scheming, or all the kind of ugly side of it. The same thing, like the history in Europe. When I read about it, I was like, well, it's very bloody for centuries. But exactly as you said, the reason is because the female angle is missing. I think you have an interesting example there talking about the Civil War in the US, right? And saying like the historian picked it up, saying the exact reason it ended is because the women who are at home writing to their husbands and saying that you have to come back.
But I think that's so interesting. I was fascinated when I came across that analysis, that you can do all this careful combing back through historical records, but if you're ignoring 50% of the population, you're not going to come to the right conclusions about what really happened. And just this idea that somehow we can ignore half the world and that it won't make any difference to our conclusions. But I mean, it's not just that it'd be okay with it, it's the idea that it won't make us come to the wrong conclusions.
Right.
It's just crazy when you think about it. Of course, you're going to, if you're missing out 50% of the data, you're going to make the wrong assumptions. You're going to make mistakes because you don't have the full picture. You don't have the full information. And I feel so sad hearing you say that about your daughter, saying, well, first of all, I feel impressed because I think that I think it's quite unusual. Maybe this is just me trying to make myself feel better for having taken till I was 25 and reading it in a book to come to feminism. But I think we don't tend to question our reality as it is presented to us. We just take the world as it comes. This is just the way things are. So for a start, questioning why is it all war, I think is actually, I think that's very impressive. But I also feel, really sad for her because it just is yet another example of how we are still teaching girls that history was about men, because of course the wars were mainly about men. What were the women doing when the men were fighting? Nobody seems to know or care. No one really looks into it, but of course they were there. Of course they were there. Like there wouldn't be any humanity without women. So they were there, but we just sort of don't seem to notice that we're not talking about them, and we sort of think it doesn't matter. It's staggering to me.
Right. And I think it was interesting. I think you also mentioned in your book about your review of the history textbook in the UK, and talking about how women were being represented there. And then it was always, if it deserves a mention, it's in this chapter called Women.
Yeah.
Like a very small section. Oh, by the way, other than the history, there is this appendix, right, around like the 3 women you should know that has played a role, which is very similar, because although you didn't read the Chinese textbook, it's the same. Like, there will be actually I guess, respected sources, even on social media, like not the history book itself. And then they would talk about women as if, okay, by the way, there is this woman you should notice in this 300 years. Oh, by the way, there is.
Someone sent me this amazing tweet thread today about, it was by I think maybe a classical historian or something, and he was doing like a kind of fun thread about how you could become a Roman emperor, and it was, all the things that would have to happen, like you would need to be part of this family, and you would need to have done XYZ, but the number one thing that you needed to be, that he didn't mention, was to be a man. But that it was so interesting to me that he thought of all these other things that you should mention about the things you need to do, but the most obvious one, and he wrote the tweet thread kind of gender neutrally, like, this is what you would do. He didn't say this is what men would do. And I just found that so interesting that continues.
Right. Maybe share with us something you did. I think you pushed something quite amazing of including more females on the banknotes in the UK. That came before the book, right? Can you share a little bit of that experience? And I think you captured, for people who are interested in the story, there's more analysis and review of it in the book itself. But since we have Caroline live, can you share with us a bit of your journey?
Sure. So basically what happened was that the Bank of England announced that they were removing the only female historical figure from the back of our banknotes. So we have 4 banknotes, the £5, £10, £20 and £50. And there's a historical figure on the back of each of them, a different historical figure. And on the £5 note, we used to have Elizabeth Fry, who was a campaigner in the Victorian era, like for, I don't know, social causes. And they were going to replace her with Winston Churchill. And that meant that all of the banknotes were going to have men on the back of them. And I was fairly newly converted as a feminist at this point. I was maybe 3 years into being a feminist. And so I was still very passionate and also quite naive, because I had just had this big like light bulb moment. And so I kind of felt like everyone just needs to have this pointed out to them, and then they'll agree with me, because that's what happened to me. I had it pointed out to me and I was like, oh yeah, good point. And so I set up this petition, kind of naively expecting that the Bank of England would be like, oh, we hadn't noticed that we were making all the banknotes of men. Thank you for pointing this out to us. We'll sort that out. That wasn't what they did.
They were saying we have an objective standard.
They did. They said, we've got some objective standards, pat you on the head, run along now, silly woman. So, it turned into this whole big campaign and a big sort of media storm. And I think it was about 3 months later, the Bank of England backtracked and they said, okay, fine. So they announced they were going to put Jane Austen on the back of the £10 note. What was more important to me was that they said, we're actually going to overhaul our procedure for deciding who gets to be on the back of the banknotes. And so they committed that basically this was never going to happen again, because they were going to, part of the criteria now was to ensure a diversity of representation, so that the actual history of the UK, which, spoiler, did include women, would be properly represented, because that was kind of the aim of the banknotes. The banknotes are meant to sort of celebrate the great and glorious of English history. And apparently it was all men. Women did nothing. according to the banknotes.
I know. Well, first of all, congratulations. This is amazing. I mean,
Thank you.
And yeah, I think I was saying it's a what's really impressed me in that whole chapter where you talked about it is how hard it is to find it, because in a way the standard they put out seems objective, right? So like saying that you need to have certain amount of awareness, you need to have certain position, you have had certain social influence, but the system is designed to negate women of that. I think you have quite a few examples of musicians like who basically sisters of famous musicians and their work are represented by their male siblings. And also the composers, right, who doesn't sit on the head of whatever academy, so they women can get their work into more a mainstream sort of a collection of music. So there are all those things. So like, and then similarly to what we talked about in history, it's the same thing. Yes, it's half of the people, I guess everybody recognize it, but because it was never, so it's almost a vicious cycle, because it was never talked about, and therefore it's okay not to talk about it. And therefore there are fewer women being known or being in the position of influence to advocate for it, and therefore there are fewer women. So that's why this thing has been basically there forever. This is not something that has changed.
One of the stipulations on the original Bank of England criteria for how to decide who gets to be on the back of a banknote was one of them had to be they had to have broad name recognition. So you had to already be famous, and that basically wipes women out because we forget about all the amazing things that women have done in history, and the women who have any kind of who have made any stamp on the history books have been by definition incredible because all of the obstacles that were put up in women's way. But that doesn't mean that they have broad name recognition, because while they may have been a composer in the past, and it turns out there were loads of composers in the past, and there were female artists, and there were all these women doing amazing things that women weren't meant to do, but they're not well known because they didn't have the money and the status to ensure that they got remembered and that their work was continually performed or continually showcased. And so this insistence that the general public must have heard of you, as opposed to some specialist historians, in order to deserve a position on a banknote, sounds like a really objective, non-sexist, it's a gender neutral criteria, but actually hidden underneath it, there's actually a strong male bias because we are much more likely to know the names of men.
Yeah. But I guess I'm curious, what's your view, like what's the way out? Because as I said, as you said, beautifully time and time again in this book, women's opinion don't get sought, get sought after, and therefore their view or their needs don't get represented. And then this kind of continues, right? So it's almost a self-fulfilling circle that continue to have women invisible or unheard of in basically all walks of life. Sometimes if you think about it, it's kind of depressing. It's make you pessimistic. What do you think will, kind of tip the balance?
It's depressing. It is depressing, particularly when you think about the consequences of it. And, people often ask me, like, what was the most shocking thing you came across in your research? And all of it's really shocking, right? Like the idea that we design car safety around male bodies and women are more likely to die in a car crash. The fact that, that women are more likely to die from a heart attack because we don't know how to spot them in women. Like, that's all incredibly shocking. It's quite hard to pick a specific example. But what I often think about when I get asked that question is, what really shocks me is the excuses that researchers will give when I challenge them or someone else challenges them. Because when you get to the point of giving me an excuse, then that's no longer you just somehow not having noticed that your car crash test dummy is a man. I hold out that hope that it's mainly we just didn't notice, like with me and the gender neutral language. I just didn't notice. Maybe the car manufacturers just didn't notice. Maybe the Bank of England just didn't notice. I'm perpetually optimistic. But But once you're giving excuses, that means that you have noticed, but somehow you still think it's okay. So for example, if you look at medicine or any kind of research on the body, researchers will say, well, we don't want to include females because the menstrual cycle will interfere with the results. Well, yeah, that's true. It will interfere with the results. And that's exactly why you need to study it. Exactly. Because there are real life bodies out there taking this medication or following this advice that have menstrual cycles that will be interfering with the results in real life. And sometimes those interferences can be really serious. So like women are more likely to experience drug-induced heart rhythm abnormalities, and this is most likely to happen during the first half of the menstrual cycle. That feels like a really important thing that you need to know, rather than saying, oh, well, the menstrual cycle will interfere with the results, so we'll just pretend it doesn't exist.
Yeah, it didn't exist.
So, you know, that is worrying and frustrating. I mean, I do feel like it comes back to the default male, because these are the options, right? The options are that someone who says that hates women and doesn't care if we die. I prefer not to believe that option. The other option is that someone like that is still harboring somehow under the delusion that the body of 50% of the global population is somehow niche. And that and to me, it kind of illustrates how powerful this default male bias is, that even when people are actually talking about the fact that men dominate in research, they are using the default male bias as a way of defending what they're doing, if that makes sense. Like, it doesn't make sense to say that this bodily function that occurs in 50% of bodies will interfere with the results, so we'll get rid of it. That only makes sense if somehow you're conceptualizing this bodily function as something that doesn't really happen to a lot of people. So that's not answering your question. Your question is, how are we going to fix it? And I suppose I do still believe in the power of awareness, you know, growing awareness, sharing this information, having people become more and more attuned to the fact that this is happening. And I have had, you know, researchers get in touch with me to say that they actually hadn't really noticed that they were doing this. And now that they had noticed, they've changed their research practice. And in fact, one female researcher got in touch with me that really, really struck me, because she said that she said, I was one of those researchers who used to say, oh my God, really, do we have to include women? Like, it just makes it so much more complicated. It costs more money. Like, I just want to do my nice, easy test. And then she read the book and was like, oh, wow. Okay, yeah, good point. We do need to include women. And I found that really, really interesting, because, you know, that to me is a perfect example of the problem, is that somehow this bias is so strong that even a woman who knows that we're meant to include women doesn't want to include women. And then but then it also gives a perfect example of the solution, which is that she had it explained to her in such a way that it got through, and she suddenly realized, oh no, this really matters. So I'm not saying that every single person who reads my book, you know, goes away and is never does default male ever again. But I do feel that that's the only way we're ever going to change this, is by having enough people aware of this as an issue, and not just researchers. You know, we have power as consumers as well, right? Like, when I think about the car example, so I should probably explain it for people who are watching.
Yeah, exactly. I was about to mention that in detail, but it's very shocking data. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So historically, the only car crash test dummy that was used, and it's still the most commonly used car crash test dummy, is based around the body of an average American man. And obviously that leaves out a lot of people from representation.
I think it's a man with 77 kilograms of weight and 177 centimeters in height, or something like that. I remember the data, which is very far from.
I have to say, I don't remember, but
that was
I don't remember off the top of my head, but good knowledge. It's definitely not a woman. You know, there does exist what is called a female car crash test dummy, but it's basically just a very scaled down version of the male dummy. And of course, women are not just small men. Like, we are on average smaller than men, but there are other differences, like, you know, our pelvises, muscle mass distribution. So men tend to carry more muscle mass on their upper body and their neck than women, which is really important in the context of a crash where your body is being thrown about. So obviously the strength of your neck is really important. Things like breast tissue, like all of these differences come into play. So let me give you an example of how that can play out in the context of a car crash. So the seatbelt has been designed in the event of a crash to catch onto your hip bones, which obviously are stronger than your soft tissue, to withstand the force of the crash. But they're designed around a male pelvis because the car crash test dummies have a male pelvis. And the problem is that the female pelvis obviously is slightly different. And this means that instead of catching on your hip bones, the seatbelt can ride up and instead catch you on your soft tissue. And of course, in the event of a big crash, that can cause catastrophic bleeding because your organs and soft tissue are not designed to withhold that kind of force. There are other things like, for example, because women are on average shorter, they tend to sit further forward, which is a more dangerous position to be sitting in the event of a crash. And that is really because the car has been designed with the idea that you'll sit further back, where a man might sit, which is something I think of every time I have to move the car seat forward in order to be able to reach the steering wheel and reach the pedals. You know, like, I can't safely sit further back than I do, but I'm aware every time I pull it forward from where my husband sits that I'm moving myself into the danger zone. Women get thrown further forward in the event of a crash. This is because the seats have been designed to absorb the weight of a much bigger body. And so women kind of bounce off it instead of being absorbed into it. Anyway, all these differences mean that in the event of a crash, a woman is 17% more likely to die and 47% more likely to be seriously injured than a man in the same car crash. And I can't remember why I said I needed to explain cars. Something about changing people's minds.
Yeah, well, no, I think that piece, as I said earlier, it was shocking. And then, you know, and I think in a way, you talked about examples, right? So there are actually now more awareness of that.
Oh, yes,
right?
So it was the idea that most women don't know this.
Yeah.
Most people don't know this. No. When they find out, they're incredibly shocked and they're angry, as they should be.
Yeah.
But what will change things is consumers demanding that change. But consumers can only demand that change if they actually know that this is happening. Yeah. So I think that is a really good example of the kind of power we have to make change. Yes, designers have a huge amount of power, and manufacturers have a huge amount of power, and researchers have a huge amount of power. But we also, you know, those of us who aren't any of those things have power in what we decide to buy and what we decide to do, and whether or not we decide to challenge manufacturers on their practices.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, that's a very, I mean, going back to the original question, I think that's the excellent answer indeed. So like sometimes people say, hey, there's a lot of data in this book. It doesn't, well, what does it change? Well, I want to say data does change. So when people see the data, there's more awareness. There is more self-education going on, right? So like, you know, for consumer to take actions, consumer need to know what are they buying, what danger they're putting themselves into by buying this car. And I think the other example that was mentioned is also very shocking to me in your book is about the BPAs. Do you remember you talked about the BPA, the plastic being used in the bottles? Of course, my first child was born in 2010, and I realized that data point is saying it's only in 2008 it became sort of eliminated, but that for years before that it was very prevalent, and it's carcinogenic and everything. But what shocked me was not about how this whole movement, but I think you have this mission saying that you know, women was mentioned there because, you know, if you are a mother, if you're, you know, going through pregnancy, or if you're having children and feeding your baby with bottles with BPA, it's bad. And then people get it, but completely ignoring the fact that there's a lot of women working on assembly lines of those factories who are exposed to like 1,000 times more than what's the consumer have in the bottle. But as if only women's function as a childbearing, vehicle or a mother, and that's worth mentioning, because you're in a way almost putting the men's offsprings to danger. But if you're a woman by yourself, you're working there, it's okay. Like, people don't mention that. That was very shocking.
I mean, that whole area is one that still depresses me a lot, because again, so much of it is hidden because companies are not required to declare all sorts of ingredients that they use in their manufacturing processes. And again, I just find that so hard to understand how anyone can defend that. People have a right to know what they're buying. And it seems crazy to me that any politician would defend the right of a company to hide the ingredients that they're putting in the products that you buy. And yet that is what happens. Anytime you see a label, I mean, I have to say this is in Europe and the US. I'm not aware of what the regulations are like in China, but certainly in Europe and the US, you can hide a multitude of sins under the term fragrance, because you don't need to say what is in the fragrance. And that quite often can be these endocrine disrupting chemicals, which is just infuriating. And so, as you said, this is partly for consumers, but even more so for the women who work with these with these ingredients, either because they're producing them or because they're using them. So one of the examples that I gave was women who work in nail salons, and the incredibly sort of potent chemicals that they're exposed to on a daily basis, with very little research for the impact on their bodies, and very little regulation for the workplace to ensure that the air is of good quality, that they have good protective equipment. Although on that topic of protective equipment, even if they did have protective equipment, the likelihood is that it would be designed for men. So it wouldn't work that well anyway.
But it was interesting, because I recently had a live stream with a nonprofit organization in China who works for migrant women workers. So like, those are the workers that work in basically all the made in China factories. And that's exactly what they said earlier, saying that, people tend to think about women. If you talk about women issue, I think that issue has also been narrowed significantly, as if when you talk about women, you're talking about, okay, as a mother, or, as a educator, as a caregiver. But there are a lot of women who are workers as well. I think you mentioned quite extensively in your book, talking about even in the US, people talk about low-waged, like working class, as if people think about a miner, somebody who works in a construction site. But actually, if you think about the cleaner, like people who are doing the janitor work, they are much bigger in terms of population for the men, and they get paid less. So like, they were more the working class representation than, the poor white man, kind of have their idea on. So that was very, so like, when I mentioned that example from your book, talking about the BPA assembly line workers, and she said that's exactly true, because frankly, I would say more than half of the workers in the assembly line are women in China. And they are usually young women who, probably finished their middle school and didn't even go to high school, and then go find they're from rural part and go to China, go to cities to work in those factories. And their working condition is horrific. There isn't even a mention of that, but only when a women issue comes to like sex assault, like, like those kind of things seem to be the women issue, but not women who actually are participative in very mainstream part of our, societal operation.
Yeah. That was a really important part of writing the book to me, is that women so often do get reduced to their reproductive function or violence against women. And those issues are important. And of course, they're part of the female experience. But I really wanted to show how this is an issue that extends way beyond these sort of classically female issues that we talk about. And also, I feel like a broken record here, but I do think that that's part of the default male, right? Those are the parts of life that men don't experience, and therefore those are niche women's topics. Everything else is about men. So the workplace is about men, and factories are about men, and cars are about men, and disasters are about men, and the economy is about men. And of course, women are participating in all those things too, and they affect women as well. But we only ever talk about women when we're specifically talking about these quote unquote women's issues. And so that was a really important point for me to try and make through the book, through writing this book that looked at all these different areas where gender neutral policies are negatively impacting women, was also to deliver the message that we have to stop talking about women as if the only things that pertain to women are sexual assault and pregnancy.
Exactly.
Because
that's absolutely
a small part of women's lives.
Yeah, absolutely. As if we live in the Middle Age, you're just the wives stay at home and breed children. Yeah, that's what you do. But in addition, you're also doing a lot of things that men are doing. And that part gets, conveniently forgotten. And and I think the other very interesting data you mentioned, kind of connected to that, is the entire calculation of GDP. Actually, it's from your book. I learned how the GDP was originated, how the idea get, sort of the statistic get invented post the Depression in the US. And it was amazing because it was, I guess I just and many people think GDP is a pretty objective, sound term, because there's a way of predicting, but just not realizing how much subjectivity goes there, what get included. And then especially the data talking about, if, of course, I think now, at least thanks to years of advocacy, there are more people being aware of the unpaid work. But still, I think your book made this very striking point around, if we really put unpaid work into GDP, that would be the biggest industry in many countries. I think that was very share a bit about,
it's funny. I mean, yes, everyone thinks of GDP that way because that's how we speak about it. We say GDP has gone up to this, GDP has gone down to that, and that's meant to tell us everything we need to know about the economy. And nobody talks about it as this is actually just measuring one small part of the economy. It's measuring the market part of the economy. That actually there are all these other things that are economic activities, and also that we care about, that matter for human well-being, which is related to the economy. But yeah, I found that absolutely fascinating, that when we have actually done the analysis. So I think one of the studies that I cited was a study in Australia, which found, so in the formal economy, the financial services sector in Australia is the biggest industry. But if you counted childcare, unpaid childcare, it was the number one industry in Australia in terms of its contribution to the economy. And the second biggest was other household services. So the financial services sector came third, actually, in terms of its contribution to the economy, which is sort of staggering. And when you frame it like that, it becomes so clear that the way we're making decisions about what we should fund, what we should prioritize, is completely upside down. Because if we care about, I feel this is really, really important, in particular after COVID, where every country in the world is trying to rebuild their economy. And if they were paying any attention to the actual data, and also any attention to what happened during COVID, which is that loads of things sort of stopped because women were taking care of children. They didn't have time to do anything else. So suddenly you had to recognize, well, actually, maybe unpaid labor is a really important part of the economy and is propping up the formal economy. but somehow the message doesn't seem to have been learned, and you have countries like the UK, for example, which are still acting as if unpaid labor is somehow separate to the normal economy, is a cost as opposed to an input.
Yeah.
And that therefore it's something that we have to figure out how we can, you know, pay for it, how we can take other things out of the economy to give to this, not recognizing that actually, no, this is an input to the economy. And that if we were to invest in care infrastructure, then that would create way more jobs and be a much better contributor to GDP than the things that we're currently doing, which is investing in construction, which is the classic way of trying to sort of recover your economy. And it's just deeply frustrating.
Yeah. No, indeed. I think probably sometimes it's ironic. You know, maybe the reason we forget about it is because we're so good at doing it and not complaining about it, right? So it was interesting. I was having this conversation with my mother. She's staying with me now, and she's a huge help. Like she, you know, as you can imagine, she helps with cooking and everything. And then she was making this comment, which is so interesting. She said, you know, this is the kind of the thing about housework is that, you know, you are busy for a whole day, but at the end of the day, it seems like you have done nothing, right? So like, you know, you have a clean table, you cook, you eat, and then the dish get dirty, you clean again, and then the table is clean. And then like, it seems like if you go out to work and come back home, it's like nothing happened, right? So like, you know, when I left, it's a clean table. When I came back, it's a clean table.
Yeah.
But of course, she had this insight. She said, well, the thing is that if I didn't do it, you know, it's very obvious. So that's the thing. So that's the thing about opposite. It's not like when you go to a construction site, you know, if you didn't put the brake on, the building doesn't go up, right? So it's visible, like as if the work is very visible. If I didn't make this delivery, the good doesn't go from A to B. But the nature of housework is that it's the opposite. Like, you know, it's like if you don't do it, it shows. If you do it, nothing shows.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. But I mean, this is why, you know, one of the things I talk about in the book is the women of Iceland in 1975.
Oh, the long Friday, I remember. Yes.
So they took a day off because that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to make this work visible. And, you know, they succeeded.
Exactly. That was amazing. Yeah, but it was interesting how so I think that's why some of the Scandinavian countries are probably better. And of course, you also quote a lot of data from Sweden saying like they are failing in many of that aspects too. But I remember seeing one example. In 2018, I went to Finland because I was looking into education, right? Because of the school effort we had. And I found something very interesting. They were saying like, you know, of course you can, if you send your child to a public, childcare facility, that's good, it's free, right? Because it's provided. But if you decide not to do it, you actually get paid. You know, you actually get paid for, you know, staying home and taking care of your child because you didn't take a space in that childcare facility, which I thought is, you know, makes sense, right? And because I didn't take up public resources and I'm doing that, I get paid for doing that. I think so that sometimes you see these examples that give you hope and saying, yeah, there are people who have figured it out. You know, it's one way or the other. Either you provided by public funding in the facility or somebody else is doing it. Although you don't see those children, it's not like they're not being cared for. But those examples are too bad, are kind of far and in between, but at least there's some examples of those.
Yeah, no, that's, I mean, I hadn't come across that. That's a fantastic example. And I wish that we could do it in other countries.
Right, indeed. So that's
it'll never happen in the UK. They'll never do it. Not with this government anyway.
So, but I guess that's what you're highlighting in your book time and time again, is that actually the solutions are not difficult and they're not even costly, right? So like it's not like you don't even have to spend extra money. It's there. It's really from thinking, you know, being aware of this issue and reallocating. Reallocate. It's exactly that. It's choosing to spend the money differently,
right? Rather than having to spend extra money. The money's there. And it really is just about priorities. And we've got our priorities all wrong. And part of the reason we have our priorities all wrong is because we haven't been collecting the data. The other reason that we have our priorities all wrong is we aren't listening to the data that we do have, because the data we do have makes it very, very clear that you should invest in social care infrastructure. You should invest in childcare. That is going to be a massive driver of the economy because it frees women up to go into the paid labor force. And that creates more tax revenues, etc. It's a virtuous circle. It creates more jobs for women. Like, it just totally makes sense.
Yeah.
And why don't we do it? I really don't have a good answer to that, except for, you know, we're bad at change. And we just have got so used to this is the way we do things, and people are scared of change. I mean, I think that's, how else can you possibly explain it?
Yeah, it's this inertia, I think.
Yeah.
Inertia, yeah. And then I think in your book, you actually talked about it. I think the last few chapters is talking about public life around, you know, there's data actually showing when there's more women in decision making or parliaments, you know, in those kind of positions, things do change. I think it was interesting how few of them are there. I think this is true everywhere. And then, like, it occurs to me every day almost, if you just follow the news, right? So look at what's happening, you know, in different countries. You look at the summit, you look at the UN assembly, like, you know, all the major sort of, you know, public forums, it's majority men.
Yeah.
As if only when we talk about UN women, there's women talking about women. But actually, the, you know, from international to national levels of, you know, political representation, you know, if you read the news, sometimes I'm more aware of it after I become a mother. I was like, you know, what image am my daughter getting? Like, if you look at all those big international news, the summits, the meetings, you know, it's all men. Like, that's it's probably more
I mean, and that's
like,
probably another reason why we don't listen to the data and make the changes. It's because it's too male dominated. Yeah,
indeed. I think you quoted some very interesting data, because of course I'm not from the UK, but you're saying this minimum, is it called all women shortlist? Right. And then talking about how that has actually changed the representation of women, which actually quite remarkable looking at the data. Can you explain a bit like what it is, especially for people who probably do not know about the UK political system?
Yes. So basically, all women shortlists are something that was introduced by Labour, which is the left-wing party in the UK. And what they did was they wanted to find a way of getting more female members of parliament in. And that's quite difficult in the UK because we have a first past the post system. So for countries where they have proportional representation, it's easier to get more women in because you can have this whole list of people, and depending on the number of votes you get, you know, those people will get in, and it's just, you know, you'll get a range of people. But in the UK, it's one person, winner takes all. And so unless your candidate is female, you know, you're not going to change the representation of parliament. Sorry, I'm explaining this really badly. But anyway, basically the way that what they did was to ensure that they would, I'm going to start again. I'm sorry. Okay, so all women shortlist, because you don't really need to know all that stuff. So all women shortlist is basically for each district that has an MP. For each party, they will choose who their representative is going to be. And usually the way that they choose their representative who's going to go up for the general election is they will have an election within the party of all the people who stand. And what they introduced for certain districts was that only women could stand in that district, so that whatever happened, the person who stood at the general election for the Labour Party would be a woman. And they made sure that they chose this to be in seats that they thought that they were probably going to win. Because if you put them all in the seats that they were definitely not going to win, it wouldn't have made any difference at all. So they had some of them in seats that they thought they were going to win. And that basically is what all women shortlists are. It's that so that they can ensure that in this particular district, a woman will be the person who's put forward to run against all the other parties. And of course, she might not win, but if Labour does win, then they'll have a woman representing them. so that's a sort of workaround for the UK. It's not always been very popular. And the reason it's not been very popular is because of this winner takes all system that we have in the UK. And I actually think a better system is the proportional representation system of zipped lists. And so what happens in those countries is they come up with, so a party that uses this will come up with a list in order of preference of male candidates and female candidates, and they'll have them separately, and then they'll zip them together. And so it goes man, woman, man, woman, man, woman. And the reason that that helps is because in those systems, when they're voting, the number of votes each party gets determines how many names on their list get elected. And so if you've got alternate man, woman, you end up with a pretty gender equal selection as you go down the list. And that feels a lot more fair to people because it's alternate. So you've got men and women. With the all women shortlists, you know, in that particular district, only women can stand, you know, understandably, some men feel that it's unfair. And in that district, it is unfair. It's unfair on the men who live in that district. Like overall, men are still overrepresented, but that doesn't really mean much to the guy who didn't get to stand because he's not a woman. So it's an imperfect solution, but given the voting system that we have in the UK, it's the only way to ensure that we can do something about female representation.
Yeah. No, I think it's interesting because I think this example, also the controversy you actually talked about in the book as well. You know, some men feel like this is disadvantaging men, which fairly so in the thing, but just really highlights how complex those issues are. There isn't a sort of perfect mathematical solution. But my takeaway from that chapter is saying that that's how the society works in a way, how all the progress we've made are from, you know, this kind of imperfect solutions and, you know, micro adjustments, and trying to adapt and, you know, taking in the opinion of multiple stakeholders and getting a bit better. So let's switch gear a little bit. I think, yes, maybe the topic we talked about seems to be quite macro topics, right? We talk about GDP, we talk about history, we talk about women representation. But I think what really attracts me or fascinates me about this book, especially in the, you know, in the layout of the chapters, is how that relates to everybody's everyday life. So if you haven't read this book, so the book actually has 4 parts. It's 5 parts. And then the first part is about daily life, right? You talk about the whole unpaid work, snow cleaning, and also the restroom issue, which we'll come to. Then you talk about workplace, and you talk about designs, and you talk about going to the doctor, the medical problems, and then the public life, which we talked a little bit about, and when it goes wrong, which is the catastrophic situations where the last chapter name, which is very shocking and very sad, is that it's not a disaster that kills you, right? So it's basically all the setup around a male default assumption that kills more women. So I think the daily life part is very, very enlightening, because I think those are things we see every day, but take it for granted. It is what it is. I mean, take one example of the long lines in a women's bathroom everywhere, right? So I think it was so interesting. So when you were going through the data, I was like, well, every one of them I now see, right? So you were saying, yes, it's there's apparent equity because the area of the men and women's bathroom are the same, but there's more urinals, they're faster. I think one point really strike me is that when there's children, like usually they go with the mom, right? So like you see a lot of underage, because I have 2 boys and a girl. Like when my boys are under 6 years old, it's always me taking them to the bathroom, not their dad. So you know, it was so common, but like we just kind of take it for granted. Like you just take it for granted. There's longer line in the women's bathroom. They're away for longer. But there's very little change though. So maybe elaborate on that, like the daily life examples we have.
I hope there will be change on the toilets at least. I mean, that's sort of quite an easy one to solve. You just have to build more toilets for women, you know, because as you say, you know, so the issue is that if you have equal floor space, it's a classic it's a classic example of thinking that treating people the same when they have different needs is what equality is. And that's not equality. Equality is treating people according to their needs. And the needs for women when it comes to the toilet is that we need more toilets, because there is more demand on the women's toilet. As you were saying, women are more likely to take children with them, and they're more likely to take older people with them. And women also need to use the toilet more frequently. So if you're pregnant, you need to use the toilet more frequently. If you are on your periods, you need to use the toilet more frequently. And also you'll take longer. You know, you need to change your sanitary pad or whatever. And women also take longer just because the mechanics of the female body and clothes mean that it takes, and like, this always sounds a bit ridiculous because obviously it's not very much longer for each person, but it adds up, you know, when you're talking about systems and structures. And so having the equal floor space is not actually equal. Added to which, of course, you know, as you said, urinals take up much less space. So usually if you have equal floor space, men actually get more facilities than women. So you can have more men using the toilet, the urinal at the same time than you do have women. So ultimately what happens is that women need more facilities, but in practice often get fewer facilities than men. So that's why we queue for the toilet. And I really hope that someone's going to stop that. It makes me so angry every time I queue for the toilet. It's just such a waste of time. It's such a waste of time. And it's infuriating watching the men just, you know, swan in and out.
Yeah, exactly. There are times I went to the men's bathroom and just locked the cubicle. Well,
I went to so I was at a conference. I was speaking at a conference, and it was about feminism. So obviously there were basically no men there. And after the conference was over, everyone wanted to go to the toilet, and they had the men's toilets and the women's toilets, and the women's toilet had a massive queue. So me and some other people were like, well, there's no men here. Why can't we just use the men's toilet? So we went off into the men's toilet and we got told off. They were like, this is the man's toilet. You can't use the men's toilet. And we were like, but there's no men here. Why can't, it's just a room at this point. Yeah, that was really weird.
I know. I think it's the everyday examples that you put so many. I think for people who haven't read the book, I think I admire your work, because I think every page of it is loaded with data and research. I can only imagine how much work went into it. When you said in the beginning, it's like building up for 10 years. Yeah, I think you know, it's probably even more work than that, because there's so much data and so many examples. It was interesting because for people who follow my blog, they would know, like, I actually had a pretty bad accident myself. So I had cut in my palm. And then it cut the ligament. So I have to go through surgery and reconnect it. And then why it happened is really going back to your design, because I was getting this huge bottle of juice for my kids. And then of course the bottle, you know, it's very tight. Like, as you said, I know I have small hands, right? And then it's hard to do. And then of course I was being smart. I got a knife. I was like, I'm going to cut open the little connection. And then I kind of screwed it. And of course it slipped right on the plastic. It wasn't designed to do that. And then kind of stepped right into my head.
Oh my God.
And it was like painful and bloody. I was like, wow, of course, you know, I go through, I called my friend, took me to the ER, and anyway, I have to go through surgery, and I have 9 months of rehab. Okay. Wow. And then, but it's even at that moment I was saying, hey, I shouldn't have suffered this, you know, if there's more women, you know, thinking about, you know, when they design the bottle, right? And like, you know, if you don't have a small hand and you don't have a big hand, you're not powerful enough, not enough force in your hand, you can't open this door. But that's so common everywhere. And then
women are just completely used to it.
Yeah, exactly. And then like, and it was so interesting. And then like, if I continue with my story, of course I came back, my hand get better, but even for women I have small hands. So like, as part of the rehab, I pick up learning piano. Of course, that's another example. You went to your book and talking about how piano were designed for big hand men. And it is, right? So of course I enjoyed it, I played, but like I have to make so many changes how my fingering works to do it. I you know, of course my teacher was a man. His hand is twice my size, and then he can just easily make it. But he's tiny enough. He always try to change the fingering for me so I can manage it. Again, you can skip this, do that. But there are moments I was like, but why there aren't people thinking about that could be a smaller piano? But of course, reading your book, I know that there were a smaller piano, but you never get adopted, right? Can you maybe share that story?
Yeah, I mean, that one's just infuriating. And in fact, we've just finished, actually, no, we just released a podcast episode about this as well. Where, so basically pianos didn't used to be standardized, and they were much smaller, but they sort of ranged in different sizes. But they became standardized around the mid 1800s. And at that point, no one really knows exactly why they became the size that they did, but there is speculation that it was a lot to do with the fact that there were these big virtuoso performers and composers like Liszt, for example, who happened to have massive hands. And they were kind of involved in this proliferation and standardization and popularization of the piano. And the irony is that the piano used to be like quite a female instrument. It was seen like a domestic instrument that women played in the home. But around this time, it started being transformed into this big instrument that was played by men in concert halls. And so it got bigger. And it's just stayed that size. And the result is that the keyboard, as it is today, the standard keyboard, is actually too big for 87% of women, and actually 25% of men as well. It's really big. And the thing that's infuriating about it is, as you say, there is a smaller keyboard that is being developed that can be retrofitted to a piano, but it's really, really expensive because it's not standardized. But there are, like, with other instruments, we don't have this problem. Like with other instruments, they come in different sizes.
Yeah, violin has all different sizes. Yeah.
Right. In the recognition that humans are not all one size.
Yeah.
But for some reason with the piano, there is this obsession that you must play it at this size. And the thing that's, it's just this backwards way of thinking, right? Like that you as a human must fit yourself to this tool. The tool can't be adapted. You must adapt as a human, as opposed to, of course I can't change. Like it's my body that I'm born with. Change the tool, which was man-made. And I say man-made deliberately.
It is man, yeah, it's not woman-made.
It's not woman-made, it's man-made. We can change it. But there's this big resistance to changing it. It's crazy.
Yeah. Indeed. Anyway, so I think the book is like, it's littered with data like that, and then interesting history and how things are. And then this is, everyone, I would say, it's eye-opening, because I think that made us challenge a lot of things that we took for granted. And as Caroline, you were saying, this is sometimes it's not only, you can say, hey, maybe you don't play the piano, fine, but everybody rides a car, like you may die.
Yeah.
And then also the medicine issue, like ignoring women's hormone fluctuation as if that's an annoyance, which is just the shocking. There are many of that. And then I think the last question I have is the point, maybe a bit of a difficult one to answer, but I think that's you kind of pointed to it, which is quite deep. I think it's in chapter 14. You talked about the change, why it's so difficult. Yeah, I think it's I labeled it. You were talking about why it's so difficult, because men are resisting the change, is that the threats come from a place of fear. You're saying actually the men feel threatened by feminist or by this book or by data, because it came from a place of fear. I think that's right on. It was interesting. It's so, in a way, so ironic, because men, like, fearful, right? So like, they are the default men. They get, the most attention, like, the society, the data are designed around them, to be frank. But at the same time, yes, there is this deep place of fear. And therefore, there's so much resistance for any change. Even the change is not to kind of infringe their rights in any way, but just more to just come to the middle, right? This is like, you know, if they used to be 80%, let's just come to 50%. It's not like pushing you to 20%, but still there are a lot of resistance and fear. Yeah, maybe share a little bit about that. Like, what's your, I'm sure you also mentioned briefly in the book, like you get attacked a lot yourself, being somebody who had a public profile and speaks and writes about this book. What are some of the, you know, sort of a deeper, you know, fears you experienced? Let's go beyond the data itself, like that's resisting the change.
Yeah, so I mean, the really worst experience I had was after the banknotes campaign, where I got sent a lot of really graphic rape and death threats, and people were trying to find out my address and were posting addresses linked to me online, and it was really frightening. And you know, it also seemed so out of proportion to the campaign. You know, the campaign was for a drawing of a woman on a banknote. It was like nothing radical, really. And it was 1 out of 4. You know, I wasn't even asking for equality. I was just asking for one woman. And there were some men who found this so threatening that they felt they had to threaten to rape and kill me to shut me up. And so I thought a lot about, you know, what was it that threatened them so much? And there was one thing that one man said to me that I found really instructive. This wasn't a man who was threatening me, but he was angry about my campaign. And he said, but women are everywhere now. And I found that really interesting, because obviously women were not everywhere now. That's why I was having to campaign for 1 woman out of 4 banknotes. But he clearly felt it that way. He that's how he experienced the world. And so where does that come from? Well, I think it comes from the fact that there are more women in public life than there were 20 years ago, let's say. And so if you were born 20 years ago as a man, you were born seeing the world as incredibly male, and that was what felt normal to you. And now things are sort of changing a bit, and we have a tiny little bit of women breaking through into the public space. And so that feels to men as too many women, you know, because what they're used to is what they think is normal, and therefore that they think is equal. And so they experience this slight increase of women as threatening to their own position in public life. So, you know, I feel like that's where that comes from. And I also feel like that is something that is only going to stop once we've achieved equality, because it's only once it's completely normal for a woman to be president, for women to be represented equally in films, in TV, in public life, in company leadership, that it's going to stop feeling threatening. Because once it's normal, it's no longer threatening. But at the moment, it's not normal, it's a change, and people find change scary. And you know, yeah, it's gonna be tricky. It's gonna carry on until it stops.
Yeah,
unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, I guess the bad news is that there's a long way to go until it's normal. So
yeah, sorry. But you know, I think that one of the things that has been really great about this book is how many men have read it actually, and have taken on its message, and have you know, been similarly shocked as women are by the data that I present, and recognize that this is unfair. And that has been really great to see, because I mean, that was a very deliberate, I mean, that was something that I wanted. You know, I didn't want to write a book that was preaching to the choir, that only people who already agreed with me would read, because, you know, I came from that experience of reading a book and having it change my mind. So I believe so strongly in that. And I really wanted to be able to do that for other people, you know, to say, here is a book that you may not already agree with, but stick with me and maybe you'll change your mind.
Yeah, indeed. I think that's beautifully said. I think one thing I find interesting, in a way it's being presented, because it's, frankly, if you allow me to say, it's actually presented in a very how do I say, cool-minded way. So like there's a lot of data, a lot of research. It's not a lot of emotion. Of course, there are emotion, saying those data, and then that's a very natural outburst. But it's based on facts, right? So I think facts is something that unites people. Doesn't matter if you're man or women. And so like oftentimes that's where the change comes. It's actually from a man who has daughter, right? And who wanted his daughter's, fate to be different and to achieve her full potential. I see quite some of that myself, like in my colleagues, previous colleagues, both in different places I worked with. And those are actually, sometimes the biggest advocates. And on the other hand, sometimes for women, it's also very interesting, as you said, like one thing, bothers me a bit from the nail salon example is that almost 100% of consumers there are women too, right? So it's not like it's a man consuming women's labor, it's women consuming women's labor, but then like they are okay with it. So like, like it's not like because we are women, then we're fine. Like we don't have to stand out for this issue. It's not true. Like I think you have this example from New York Times around the worth less than a shoe, right? So it was a nail salon person spilled something on, on customer's shoe, cost $275, and then that must be a woman. So oftentimes you think about it's. I think that's probably what's meaningful about this book as well. It's not dividing, saying that okay, all women are angels, or men are evil, but it's actually that thinking in ourselves. Like everybody can actually come and realize certain facts we are not aware of before, and we haven't challenged before, haven't asked the why. And once you ask,
I mean, I'm a woman and I have that bias in myself. And also, it always sort of kind of amuses me when people are shocked when women are sexist. Of course, women are sexist. We live in the same society as men do, like we imbibe the same cultural messages. We don't live in a special woman vacuum. It would be weird if women weren't sexist. Of course we're sexist. I think the difference between men and women in this area is more that it's perhaps easier for us to understand, once it's explained to us, no, this is what's going on. It makes sense because we're like, oh yes, okay, that's my experience of the world. And so for men, I guess it's harder to get there, but that's really the only difference, because unless, I point again to myself, I did not grow up a feminist. Feminism did not come naturally to me because I grew up in a sexist world and I just accepted the world as it was presented to me, and it took having someone point out these issues for me to recognize it in my own head. And I wonder, if I'd read that book as a man, probably wouldn't have had that same impact on me, because he'd have been like, yeah, I'm picturing a man, so what? I'm a man. But I think that's why this the enlightening part of this book is that it is, just as any change, it actually happens at individual level. Because I think this is sometimes I get from my books. I was like, okay, just like, there's so many bad things happening in the macro world. I'm just this little person, right? So like, what can I do? But that's exactly how change happened. I think it doesn't matter if you're a man or woman. If as yourself, 20 years ago or 10 years ago reading that book, if you get touched, even by one piece of data in this book and think, okay, I now look at the world differently, and that's exactly where the change starts. So thank you so much again, Caroline, for writing this book and and for sharing with us your stories and experiences. That's extremely enlightening. Thank you again. Well, thank you very much for having me.
Wonderful. Okay, I think we're on time. All right. Okay, thank you so much.
Okay.
I really enjoyed it. I have to go around to get my kids.
Okay, good luck. Lovely to chat to you. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye. Yeah.